pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for the third lecture in the MA in Hispanic Studies lecture series, which started last year. My name is Brad Nelson. I'm chair of the Department of Classics, Modern Languages, and Linguistics, co-sponsor along with the Faculty of Arts and Sciences for our talk from Professor Laura Colantoni from the University of Toronto. I know Dr. Colantoni well. We both graduated from the University of Minnesota within 1 year of each other. We're very happy to be able to have her here this afternoon to give a talk on linguistics. Professor Colantoni is an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Toronto, and she also holds an appointment as an associate faculty member in the Department of Linguistics, a direction we're trying to take our own program here as well. She is currently preparing 2 books, Second Language Speech, An Introduction, forthcoming at Cambridge University Press, and Perspectivas Teóricas y Experimentales sobre el Español en la Argentina, co-edited with C. Rodriguez Louro. This afternoon, Dr. Colantoni is going to deliver a talk entitled L2 Speech as an Experiment. Please help me welcome her.
Thank you, Brad, for the invitation. Thank you, Goretti, for all your emails. I'm really, really happy to be here, and I'm hoping not to disappoint you. If you want to ask questions during the talk, it's a small group, so feel free to interrupt me because I know that we come from different backgrounds. And what I try to do with the title, I think the title reflects a path that I have followed in my career. I got to work on L2 speech when I arrived to the University of Toronto with one of Heather's former students. So everything I learned about L2 speech is something that I learned from Jeffrey Steele. And I'm going to be talking, the first part of the talk will be a project that we've had for the last 9 years at U of T. And the second part is a new project that I'm undertaking with a colleague in Pittsburgh and another colleague in Toronto. So my background is in phonetics and phonology, L1 phonetics and phonology, and I'm interested mostly in sound change. So I'm going to have a different perspective at L2 because I'm interested what we can learn about the L1 by looking at what second language speakers do. So this is just to give you some background. We can approach L2 speech from very, very different perspectives. We can be interested in what the motivations for learning are. We can be interested in what happens with the amount of exposure that a learner may have to language, what the quality of the input is, what the perception of L2 speech is by L1 speakers, so what happens with the perception of foreign accent, what are the methods for improving pronunciation, what are the phonological representations that L2 speakers have, how categorization takes place, and what I'm interested in, it's what are the phonetic processes, what happens in perception and production, and what the theories of perception and production have to say about what's going on in the process of learning a second language. Why should we study second language speech? We can study second language speech because we're interested in the second language in the L2. We're interested in the processes that are frequent in second language or in development, or because we are interested, and this is my case, because we're interested in the first language. We're interested in the similarities between the processes that are common in second language speech and those that are attested in the first language, interested in cross-linguistic perception and production, or in sound change. And because we want to find out more about the specific structure in the L1. So the approach that I'm going to take now is to look at L2 speech as an experiment. And what I'm talking about here is a distinction that Ohala made in the 70s between what he called the man-made control experiments and the nature-made controls. And he put the example in that paper. He put the example of a blackout that happened in 1973, I think. There was another one in 2003, so the example is the same. And he put the example of whatever. If we wanted to study the birth rate, and we can run an experiment and ask couples, put couples in seclusion, and cut the electricity, cut the TV, and see if the birth rate goes up 9 months later. We will never get ethics approval for something like that, but that would be a man-made control. Or we can do a nature-made control experiment And when there's a blackout, study what happens 9 months later and see if the birth rate goes up or down. The take that I'm taking is that L2 studies are a nature-made control experiment. So we can draw parallels between the processes that occur in L2 speech and those that are observed in cross-linguistic studies in synchronic variation and in sound change. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the questions that we have been exploring, most of the questions that, or rather on the questions than on the answers. The methods that we have used to explore those questions. And I'm going to talk about 2 projects. A project that it's almost over, the cluster project with Jeffrey Steele in the Department of French at the University of Toronto, and a new project that I have started a year ago with Marta Ortega Llevaria. And now, there are 2 more researchers, Alana Jones and Jose Ignacio Walden, working on the project. So the questions for the cluster project. The first question that we try to answer is, why are some structures so difficult to acquire? The second question is, what is the nature of the difficulty? Is an articulatory problem? Is a perceptual problem? Any other problem? Both. What is the role of the L1 phonetic variation in accounting for difficulty? And the last one is, how can we measure if a given structure has been acquired or not? And these are questions. I have more questions than answers. For the intonation project, that's the second project, how do L2 speakers tease apart universal from language-specific aspects when acquiring intonation? And we'll see that the acquisition of intonation is very, very different from the acquisition of segmental features. Which features of the L1 prosody are present in the speech of second language learners? And what can we learn about the L1 prosody studying the L2 prosody? As a cluster project, first question, why are some structures so difficult to acquire? And the first thing that we did is to look at the L1 for an answer. And this is starting from observations. And remember the first time I met Jeff, he was talking about his dissertation project. And for his dissertation project, he worked on the acquisition of French by Mandarin speakers here in Montreal. And something that he observed is that when they were producing the French voiceless cluster, like tra, they would do a fricative, a voiceless fricative. But when they were producing the voice clusters, they were inserting a vowel. So when I heard that, I was like, how do you know that there's no vowel in French? And he was, we don't know. There's no vowel. Nobody has reported a vowel. The same, when English speakers acquire those clusters in Spanish and French, they have the same problem. So it's not a problem exclusive to Mandarin learners. So the first hypothesis that we have is that the source of the problem in this case may be in the phonetic characteristics of the clusters in the L1. So for the project, we had the controls, and the controls were 20 native speakers of French from continental French and Canadian French from Montreal, and 20 native speakers of Spanish, and we had 10 and 10, 10 Argentine and 10 Chilean. And then L2 learners, beginners, intermediates, and advanced for each of the language, 10 for each of the language and each of the levels, but for intermediate Spanish that we had 9. The words that we used for testing were words containing obstruent liquid cluster, like a word like drama, trabajo, tren, and the French equivalent. So we tried to look for cognates in French and in Spanish. So we didn't have the vro cluster because we don't have that cluster in Spanish. They were controlled for the voicing of the stop, so voice versus voice, liquid, the lateral versus the rhotic, stress, and the following vowel. They had to read, so 3 times. This is a lab experiment. We had a similar task with English clusters. They had to read a short test that we use to assess their proficiency, and then a questionnaire, so a standard procedure. And this is a summary. What do French speakers do when they produce the clusters? These are the native speakers. So for French native speakers, continental and Quebecois, there's no epenthesis with lateral, and there's variable epenthesis with rhotics. And there's a further asymmetry between voiced and voiceless clusters, so there's no epenthesis with voiceless clusters, but there's almost categorical epenthesis with voice clusters, so 90%. And this is an example. Let's see if I can play this down.
Du blaguéon.
The Quebecois, no epenthesis with L, no epenthesis in voiceless clusters.
Du décrasséon.
And that's a vowel, and it's a long vowel. It's beyond the threshold of perception. So it's longer than 20 milliseconds.
Dis poudré en.
And if you make an effort, you can hear the vowel. We ignore it, but if you are an L2 learner, you can probably pick up on the vowel. Spanish speakers, what do? There's an asymmetry again. Laterals, no epenthesis, rhotic epenthesis. But in Spanish, the epenthesis is categorical with voiced and voiceless clusters. The only difference is that the vowel is longer with voice clusters. But there's always epenthesis in Spanish. And this is no epenthesis with L. Epenthesis with voiceless. And epenthesis with voiced. So the take-home message for that we had when analyzing the L1 speech is that it is important to look at the details of the phonetic realization in the L1 before blaming the L2 speakers for doing something that we can interpret as transfer, and it's not transfer. They are hearing something. Second question, what is the source of the problem? What is the nature of the difficulty? Is this an articulatory problem? Is it perception? Is it both? What's the thing? What can we look at? I mean, the languages that have been studied before, they were mostly Germanic languages. In particular, most of the L2 studies are done on English, and most of the structures that have been looked at are vowels, because that's more relevant for the acquisition of English, and stop consonants. The type of stimuli are mostly monosyllabic words. When you acquire a new language, and this is if you assume that the L2 speech theories are right, and I have more and more problems as time goes by with the L2 speech theories, but we can talk about that later. But for example, taking Flege's approach, the assumption is that something is a new sound and has no L1 equivalent, and it's different, it should be easy to acquire. But if it's similar to a sound that you have in the L1, so then it should be hard to acquire. So in this case, when looking at new or similar sounds, we look at what L1 English, L2 speakers of French and Spanish did when acquiring something that it's new, and it's very different from what you have in English, which is a French R sound. It's different from the approximant that we have in English. And in English, the other sounds that, and we'll see that those are relevant for mostly Spanish, we have voice fricatives. In Spanish, the sound, the tap that we have in Spanish, is similar to the English flap that you have in later, for example. So the specific problems is that there are challenges in acquiring the French R and the Spanish R, and this is something that anyone who has taught either French or Spanish knows. It's not new. I'm not telling you something that you don't know. What we're interested is in seeing what they actually do when they try to target those sounds. In French, the R is what they call in phonology something that it's doubly marked because it's a fricative and it's a voice. So if it's a good fricative, should be voiceless, and dorsals should be voiced, or preferably voiceless. In Spanish, the segment is, we can claim that the segment is present somehow in the L1. And the other problem that we have when we're acquiring Spanish is that in English we have one R sound, but in Spanish we have two. We have a phonemic contrast with all the problems that that specific phonemic contrast has in Spanish. So when predicting the difficulty of acquisition, we can use two theories. We can use the Martinez differential hypothesis, or we decided to use two theories. I mean, there are more theories. And what that theory claims is that the sounds that are absent in the L1 and typologically more marked, they should be difficult. So something like the French R, which is not in the L1 and it's marked, should be hard. And the speech learning models that claims that sounds that have a perceptual close equivalent should be difficult. So the Spanish tap should be difficult according to Flege's model. So in order to test this perception, we went over, and for the French R, it's absent, typologically marked, should be difficult. The Spanish R, it's present in the L1 or somehow present, it's not marked, and should be easy. According to the Flege's model, the French R, it has no perceptual equivalent in the L1, so it should be easy. And the Spanish tap has a perceptual equivalent, and it should be hard. So the predictions are, the two theories make contradictory predictions for these structures. Study, the participants and the materials are the same. as those in previous studies. So we had the 10, 10, 10 for each of the languages, plus the controls. And here what we are looking at is the R sound in intervocalic position in word internal codas. So in something like comer, and parte, comer were final codas, and word initial position, but only in French, because in Spanish, in word initial position, we have the trill, we don't have the tap. And the measurements were pretty standard measurements. For the rhotic, we measured the percentage of the segment that was voiced, the duration, and we looked at the manner. So we did a qualitative analysis of the manner, and this is the summary of the results. So the interesting part is that only the advanced speakers of Spanish acquired, and we'll see how we measured the acquisition in a minute, so be patient, acquired the Spanish tap in intervocalic position. In all the other positions, and all the properties of the Spanish tap. In all the other positions, they acquired one of the phonetic properties, for example, the voicing or the duration, but not the others. And the French learners did not acquire all the properties in any of the contexts. So the summary of the results is that what I just said, the Spanish advanced speakers acquired the tap in intervocalic position, and this could be attributed to transfer because this is the context where you have it in English. The French learner only acquired manner in onsets, and this could be attributed to the role of the prominence, the position. And the most difficult context for both groups were codas, word internal and word final codas. And those are very variable contexts in the L1. And you'll see where I'm going now. So in order to evaluate the hypothesis, we can say that overall the predictions of previous models were too general. There were no details about contextual variability, no predictions about relative mastery of different phonetic parameters. So what we're seeing is in the L2 is that learners pick up one feature, pick up one phonetic feature, and they go for that feature. They don't pick up all the phonetic features at once. And the theories that we have are mostly perceptual theories, and they say very little about how the articulation of the sound is going, what the path of the acquisition of in production is. The Martinez differential hypothesis was successful at predicting the acquisition of the Spanish tap, and the targeting, but unsuccessfully at predicting the onset coda asymmetry and the targeting of manner versus voicing or over-voicing in French. This Fleggy's model was successful, but I'm not sure, at predicting the onset coda asymmetry, but fails at predicting the acquisition of the patterns that we see in French rhotics. So the take-home message for the second question is that models that base their predictions in either typology or perception do not make specific detailed predictions about the L2 production. So we need to incorporate principles of speech production because L2 speakers are human. They are not different from L1 speakers. So it's important of incorporating the findings that we have, everything that we know from theories of speech production and perception. So this is the model that we proposed almost 4 years ago. I'm still happy with the right part of the model. I think that we have to do something with the left side. But I mean, the idea was that you need perception and productions. The perception models are not enough to predict what happens in the acquisition process. Third question. So what is the role of L1 phonetic variability in accounting for difficulty? We know that we have to look at the L1, and this is my recap so far. So if you have lost me, I mean, you can come back, or if we need to take a break, this is the moment. Importance of characterizing first, I mean, you have to be sure of what the L1 structure looks like before blaming the L2 speakers. It's important to analyze production in detail and assessing the development context by context and parameter by parameter. So now, the other problem that we have is that L1 structures are variable, and some structures are more variable than others. So is this a problem when acquiring a language? Is variability a problem when acquiring language? And if you look at that question, and you know that one of the central problems of L2 is the prediction of the relative ease of acquisition, you have a variety of approaches. You can look at perception and Fleggy's approach, so if it's similar, not similar, different. You can look at production. and relative typological similarity or articulatory difficulty. But previous proposals, they make very broad predictions about category formation. But the phonetic realization is variable. So the question was, does variability in the input contribute to the acquisition problem or difficulty? And are less variable structures acquired faster and easier? When you look at variation and L2 acquisition, there are two focuses mainly. You can look at the interlanguage variability, and you know that there's more variability in L2 than in L1 if you look at production globally. And the other thing that has been looked at is that macro or social linguistic phenomena. For example, in Spanish, you know that the S rate of aspiration is variable. So there are some studies that have looked at whether L2 speakers pick up on the patterns of weakening. The other model is the talker variability. So if you expose L2 learners to a variety of talkers as opposed to one person, if that makes it easier or makes it harder for L2 speakers to acquire the language. What are the problems is that, again, the emphasis is on perception. If you look at those studies, the emphasis is on one language pairing, and most of the studies have been done on Japanese, English, and the acquisition of L and R. And there's little known, or we know very little about, within category variation. Categories that are not equally variable. And relative interlanguage variation. And you're going to see where I'm going with that within category variation in a minute. So there are two hypotheses. Either variability makes things easier or it makes things more complicated. Methods for a study, same participants, same project. We're always within the same project. The structures analyzed in this case were word medial stop-rhotic clusters. So we only look at word medial stop-rhotic clusters because in that context, in Spanish, you have the variability with the voiced clusters. You have the approximants in that context. And the acoustic parameters analyzed were similar to the ones that we analyzed before. So duration, voicing, and manner for the stop and for the rhotic. And the successful acquisition was determined by, and this will be my last point because there was a lot of debate when we got here. It's like, okay, it's harder, but how do you know? How do you measure if it's harder or not? And we decided for this paper, we decided to go for the learner's mean for each parameter compared to the range of the controls. So if one given learner for voicing was within the range of the control group, so then we said that that learner had acquired stop manner, stop voicing, etc. But it's a problem. That everything that you choose is a problem. So you have to make, in life you have to make decisions. So this was our decision here. And these are the predictions. So for the stop, for pataka, badaga, for the voicing, we have more variability in the voiceless clusters in French because we found a lot of voicing of voiceless stops in French. And the same thing in Spanish for manner, for the stop manner. Voiceless stop should be harder in French, and voice stop should be harder in Spanish because you have the approximatization. For the rhotic, in French, the voiceless cluster should be harder because you have devoicing, or that's what we think, and manner should be more problematic in voice because it's a fricative, and they have to target a fricative, voice fricative in a cluster. And we made no predictions in Spanish because in Spanish, the rhotic, it's very short and it doesn't vary in duration or in voicing. So the predictions for French, again, is that there should be greater difficulty with stop voicing and manner, with the rhotic percentage voicing in voiceless clusters, with rhotic manner in voice clusters. And for Spanish, should be more difficult stop voicing in voiceless clusters because you have the voiced rhotic, and stop manner in voice clusters. And we made no predictions about R in Spanish in the clusters. These are the results, and I'm just going to highlight two things here and here, is that if you look at voice clusters, so bra, dra, gra, in Spanish and in French, what you see is that for French, the rhotic, only 40% of the speakers acquire the voicing of the rhotic, and only 30% acquire the manner. So they did a variety of things, but they were not within the controls range for the manner. In Spanish, they had a problem with the stop manner. So only 40% of our participants acquire the approximatization in Spanish. And this is just to show you some examples of what they do, and it's something that you've heard before. But I mean, that's an intermediate Spanish speaker, and this is an advanced. And the intermediate basically targets an African, and the Spanish this is a very advanced Spanish speaker, and she has the epenthetic vowel. Voice clusters in Spanish, again.
Drama.
It's the English.
Drama.
And that's pretty native-like. And for French, this is an intermediate French speaker.
Bravo.
It's a trill. And this, you get the fricative.
Bravo.
That's an advanced French speaker. So just to evaluate our hypothesis, what we found here is that voiceless stops were acquired within French. They were acquired at a faster rate. So intermediate speakers, some intermediate speakers got it. And rhotic manner in voice clusters was acquired at a relatively good rate. But, and the overall accuracy was a problem for stop voicing, for the percentage voicing, and for the rhotic percentage voicing. And for the, within Spanish, they did better. I mean, the overall accuracy was relatively good. So, more variable structures were acquired later and less successfully, but our predictions were more accurate for Spanish, than for French. Two of our predictions for French were not supported. So what we think that happened, and what's the problem with our predictions, not with our speakers, the possible explanation is that learners are transferring the stop voicing parameters and the devoicing of liquids that you get in English. So they're transferring that to French, and they are sounding, or they're getting the same patterns as a French speaker would get. Last question for this project is, how can we measure if something has been acquired? And possibilities is comparing the means for a given parameter within a control mean. So the problem here is, okay, we compare just means, is that we may be missing the overall picture and the variability in the L1. Second possibility is what we did in what I just talked about, is comparing the L2 means against the control range. Here variability is taken into account, but we're still missing the overall picture. So we can have what I call the Frankenstein effect, because they can match the controls range for the rhotic, but not for the stop. So we are getting different, they're approaching different targets. You can do just a qualitative comparison of all the parameters, which is what we did at some point, or you can do a speaker-by-speaker analysis. But this may be a problem because when you acquire a language, you are not targeting, I mean, I assume that unless you're in an island and your input is only coming from one speaker, but you're not matching the structures or the phonetics of one speaker. You're averaging across speakers. We tried to do that once, I mean, and we didn't do that again. And this is what Jeff calls it tapestry. And what we did here is we look at and these are only, I mean, you have Spanish speakers here, intermediate speakers on top, advanced speakers on the bottom, and controls across. So for each of the S is the stop, the R is the rhotic, and the E is the epenthetic vowel. So for each of the acoustic parameters that we measured, we compare each of the learners against each of the controls, and they got a little square if they match one of the controls. So what we see is here is that somebody like SA07 match 1, 2, 3, 4 controls, but nobody else match one control in all parameters. So it's something that gives you an idea of whether they are targeting or they are modeling some speakers, but it's not, I mean, I don't think it's a good measure of whether somebody has acquired a given structure in a given language. But this is something we can talk about because we don't have a final answer, and it's always a problem. Every time that you have to assess, or every time that a manuscript comes back and it's like, how do you know that they have mastered something? It is a problem because there's no definite answer. So the contributions of this project, before I jump into the second project. First thing is that L1 phonetic variability that was not previously described, especially the epenthetic vowel in French clusters, needs to be taken into account. The other thing is that the patterns that we see in development and learning the clusters and learning the rhotics are the same patterns that we see in sound change in Romance. What I mean by that is that when you look at sound changes in rhotics, what you see is that, for example, when speakers that have a variety that has a sibilant rhotic are targeting a variety or approaching a variety that has a trill, they don't go for all the parameters. They target manner before targeting anything else. And this is the first thing, the same thing that L2 speakers are doing when acquiring the language. The second or the third thing that we learn is the importance of incorporating theories of speech perception and production. And the last point is the discussion about input variability and ease of learning. The more concrete outcome of this project was a phonetics database that it's there. You can use it, the Romance phonetics database, and it's growing. Oops, sorry. And we have all the data that I talked about is uploaded there. And we have the narratives uploaded there. And we're expanding the database with data from other Romance languages. When we started, it was just French and Spanish. But now we have Italian, Romanian, Portuguese, and something else. Yeah. So that's the first project. The second project, and I'm almost done before you collapse, is the new project. And this project, I mean, I started working on this project a year ago with Marta Ortega Echevarria. And I'll talk to you about the expansion in a minute. But we're going to expand the project to a new language beyond the 2 languages that we started analyzing. So the first question that we wanted to answer in this project is, how do L2 learners tease apart universals from language-specific aspects when acquiring L2 intonation? And intonation, I mean, I love intonation, but if you have ever worked on intonation, it's chaotic. People run away from intonation, but it's fascinating. And I think it's fascinating for the reasons that Ohala or Busenhoven claim that it's fascinating, is because in intonation, there's a link between human and animal communication. Some of the patterns that we use as human, some intonational patterns that we use as human, are the same patterns that you see in animal communication. And if you have a dog or a cat, you know that if the dog has a low pitch, means that it's angry, it's upset, it's defending his or her territory. And if it's using a high pitch, it's crying for help. And humans do the same thing. I mean, the standard pattern for questions is a rising pitch, and the standard patterns for assertions is a lowering of the pitch. So that's a universal aspect, and some people consider that biological and part of our biological endowment, and it's what is called the frequency code in intonation. In intonation, for some structures, there's an iconic relation between the form and the meaning. But I mean, not everything is universal. We don't share all our patterns with cats and dogs and whatever. Some things are somehow grammaticalized into the language. So we have to be able to tease apart these universal aspects and the aspects that get grammaticalized and how they convey meaning within the language. So what is the learner's task? As in the case of any other linguistic structures, L2 learners have to readjust their grammars. But there's a difference when acquiring intonation when you acquire segments, vowels, consonants. And this is something that you know if you take an intro to phonology class, is that segments do not have meaning. But with acquiring intonations, learners have to do a form meaning mapping, and they have to determine which of the features that they are acquiring are new and which are present in their L1 grammars and which meanings they are associating. Some are universal, some are not, some are language specifics. So the problem is that there are very few. It's growing. I think next week there's a conference on L2 prosody in Edinburgh. But there are very few existing studies on L2 intonation. And something that it's interesting is that they show differences between production of intonation and perception of intonation. And the very few cross-linguistic speech perception studies, the intonation, we know that it's something that L2 learners have a problem with. But the surprising thing is if you look at cross-linguistic perception studies, is that they show that in this case are not learners, are speakers of different language. They don't do that bad when discriminating tones. So they are pretty bad when speaking a second language, but when they are in an experimental setup and they have to discriminate tones, they're not that bad. So our proposal here was that these findings, this mismatch between perception and production, may be the result of a methodological problem. Perception studies have mostly used decontextualized sentences and discrimination paradigms, and the discrimination of tone is pretty good. We're pretty good at discriminating tones. And production studies have attempted to use more contextualized tasks, but most of the data for production studies is coming from reading tasks. And that's a problem, because to convey meaning when they're asking you to read something, if you're an actor, it's okay, but most people, you know that if you teach, most people can't read, or can't read aloud, so it's hard to come to any conclusions from analyzing read speech. And so there's a need. What we are claiming is that there's a need to compare perception and production in contextualized and decontextualized context. And the overall hypothesis for the project is that L2 speakers are going to do better in decontextualized tasks than in contextualized tasks. So we started with a pilot study. And in our pilot study, we had 10 English controls. They were recorded in Pittsburgh, 7 L1 Spanish, and I think we have 10 by now, 10 L1 Mandarin speakers, and we're going to do inuktitut. It's not that we're completely crazy. We are crazy, but it's not that. It's a crazy choice. It's because, what we're looking at here is different languages that are typologically different. Spanish is closer to English, it's an intonational language. Mandarin is a tone language. And inuktitut is an intonation-less language. What we know about, especially the inuktitut that is spoken in Nunavut, is that there's only prosodic movement at the boundaries. So you have a rising or a falling tone, but that's it. If you look at the structure of the sentence, it's flat. And one of our students has analyzed even duration patterns, and they are not using duration either to mark prominence. So that's why we want to look at the L1 inuktitut L2 English to see what they do when acquiring English. So the structure was a corrective focus, and this is something that you're probably used to doing if you're a native speaker of English, not if you're a native speaker of Spanish. Is like, did Julie give a talk? No, Laura gave a talk, or Laura gave a talk, or Laura gave a talk. So those were the three changes that we made. And the task, we had the contextualized task, perception and production, and a decontextualized task, perception and production. So I'll show you the tasks in a minute. In the contextual, in the production, we recorded our own version of the frog story, and then we had questions about the story. And in the perception, we had a matching task. So they heard a question, and they had to choose the answer that better matched the question. So it was a better answer to the question. In the decontextualized task, we had for the perception, we had a matching task. They heard a sentence that was out of the blue, and then they had 3 low-pass filter options, and they had to say which contour matched the target sentence. And in the production, they heard a sentence, and they had to repeat it. So it was a shadowing task. So this is the context, the production context.
Andy went to the
store. That was And then they had, this is the perception.
Is Bobby the dog's name?
And then they had 3 options.
Toby's the dog's name. Toby is the dog's name. Toby's the dog's name.
And they had to choose which one was a better answer to the question. This is the decontextualized, the imitation.
Andy went to the store.
To repeat. And the perception.
Andrew's computer crashed last night.
So they are low-pass filter. We got rid of the segmental information. The results that we have so far is that if you look at, we have in blue the contextualized tasks, so the frog story, and in red the decontextualized tasks, and focus on the subject, so the Andy went to the store, focus on the verb, focus on the object. And just by looking at the graphs, what you see is that Mandarin speakers were pretty good in general. They were pretty good. They were better in the no context, in the decontextualized tasks than in the contextualized tasks, but they were more or less, and we don't have stats right now because we have few speakers, but they were more or less approaching the controls in perception. Spanish speakers are a disaster. They are pretty bad everywhere. It doesn't matter if it's contextualized, decontextualized tasks. They're a little better when the focus is on the verb, because that you have the pitch movement in the central position. But they're pretty bad at discriminating pitch movements in the initial position and in final position. Second question is, which features of the L1 prosody are present in the speech of the very advanced L2 learners, and what can we learn about the L1 prosody from studying L2 intonation? So if we look at the imitation task for the analysis, what we did is we analyzed the F0 peak and the F0 maximum in the lexical words of the sentence. So in the subject, on the verb, and on the object, differences in intensity and differences in duration. And I'm just going to show you some results for differences in pitch and differences in duration with those stats. So if you look at differences in pitch, and this is the imitation task, the decontextualized task, again, when the focus was on the subject, on the verb, and on the object. What you see here is that the pitch is, the mean pitch is higher, the subject is in blue. It's higher for everybody. But if you look at what Spanish speakers are doing, the Mandarin, Mandarin are on the right, English in the center, Spanish on the left, English in the center, Spanish on the right. So if you look at Mandarin speakers, they are kind of hyper this or that. I wasn't supposed to move. So Mandarin, English, Spanish, and it's the same for the 3 graphs. What you see is that Mandarin speakers are kind of hyper-articulating pitch. And the Spanish speakers the mean is not that far from the English speaker, but the dispersion, the range, that means that some speakers were very good, some speakers were pretty bad. And the same pattern, it's true because they were very bad, not they were, some were pretty bad. You look at what happens when the focus is on the verb and when the focus is on the object, you'll see that many of the Spanish speakers are outside the box. So we have a wider dispersion. For duration, the results are at least a little bit more homogeneous or similar, and the means are a little bit closer. So what happens? The Mandarin speakers are very good at imitating the tonal patterns of the English model, and this is the decontextualized task. Those results there was no meaning there. As opposed to the English, something that Mandarin speakers do, and it was expected, they're incapable of de-accenting. So what you have is a tonal movement in each of the words. Even if the target word has a higher pitch movement, you still have a pitch movement in the other words. The Spanish speakers, they have problems at reproducing the tonal patterns, especially when the peak is not on the subject. And one of the things is that Spanish marks prominence with a low tone at the end of the utterance. It's what is called the nuclear stress rule for Spanish. And the other possibility is that pitch may not be the most frequent correlate of focus in Spanish. This is just to show you what they do in context And this gives you an idea of how they behave. And this is a Spanish speaker, and that's a Mandarin speaker. And if you look at the Spanish speaker, you're going to see that there is some tonal movement, but the range of the pitch excursion is not large compared to the Mandarin speaker. If you look at the Mandarin speaker, you're going to see what I think it's pretty clear what I was saying is that you see the lexical, the pitch movement on each word. So what can we learn about the L1? And this is just an example. It's not a big conclusion. In Spanish, there's a debate about the prosodic correlates of focus in prosody and the possibility of marking focus in situ in the syntax. But Spanish learners of English have consistent problems when trying to use pitch to mark prominence in English. Then we can make an inference, even if it's not direct inference, we can make an indirect inference that maybe there's something going on in their L1 grammar. So maybe they're not using pitch to mark focus in their L1 grammars. And this is something that it's very hard to see when analyzing the L1, because there are few people who try to run experiments to see how focus is marked in Spanish at the sentence level. They run into that problem. So just to conclude, it's important that we need a dialogue between L2 and L1 speech researchers to develop theories, to diversify the methodological approaches, to make empirical generalizations that are good for cross-linguistic patterns and for L2 patterns, for expanding our understanding of the specific L1 language contrast. So what happens in intonation, for example. Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, no, that one is good.
All right, so we have some time. We have some time for questions, and just raise your hand, and we'll get a mic to you, and you can ask a question of our speaker, Dr. Colantoni.
Do I still have to stay here?
Yeah, the
Okay.
mic is there.
Okay.
So.
Hi. Can I ask a question about
Yes.
about the first part and one about the
Yeah.
second part? So they're completely different. So should I do them one at a time?
Yeah. Let's do one at a time.
So what's really interesting about the epenthesis data that you showed us, more epenthesis with R, more epenthesis when the stop is voiced in the actual L1,
Yeah.
is, and because you're trying to connect what you're observing with typological options across languages, one thing that's quite surprising is we don't find, at least as far as I'm aware, languages, so end-state grammars, that have asymmetries. So you have to have two liquids to have branching onsets on the one hand. And when you have two liquids, you have branching onsets with both L and R.
Mm-hmm.
So the findings that you've discussed suggest that we might expect to find languages that only have branching onsets with L, and that we might also expect to find languages that only have branching onsets with one liquid. And so I'm wondering if you've looked into this.
Well, no, we haven't. We haven't at all. But it's an interesting question to explore, because I mean, in the Romance languages, you also have the pattern of Italian, where the branching onsets with L became branching or onsets with a glide. So that's an alternative, that you lose all the, or kind of lose part of the branching onsets. But we haven't looked at what happens.
You do get, I'm thinking in French that, so when the first member of a branching onset becomes particularly marked, so say you have V, for instance, so you have a voice fricative, then say English won't have vle or vre, French will have vre, but it won't have le. So you do get asymmetries within a language that do suggest that these things are different, but I can't think of any language that outright forbids one, say in Austria.
And you also have asymmetries with some of the kernels, because the tlo clusters.
Yes, of course, yeah.
The tlo clusters are.
Can I ask a second question? Okay, so the question about the second half, really interesting. Not the question, I mean the work. The question, you can decide if it's interesting or not. My question is about Mandarin. So one thing you were saying is that the Mandarin speakers actually had, they were basically sort of still had tone.
Yeah.
And that you're getting a pitch contour within each word.
Yeah.
And one thing that surprised me about that is that when you look at tone 2 Sandy in Mandarin, what happens is that if you have a 3-syllable window, and the second syllable is tone 2, which is a rising tone, it has to turn into a non-contour tone that's either going to be high or mid. So there are some contexts in the language where you are sort of getting de-accenting.
Yes.
And I'm wondering why they couldn't use those contexts to transfer into the L2.
I don't have a good answer right now because we still have to look at the data. But I think that part of the problem is that when they go into English, they don't have, those rules. They know that, each word should have I think the starting assumption is that each word should have a tone. And the tone that they seem to have is just a rising tone. It's not that they transfer all their tones. They just transfer one tonal pattern. So maybe because of that, they cannot apply all the other their rules. But that's just a tentative answer because what we have seen so far is that the patterns that they're transferring into English, it's just one. It's not that they are doing different things with the tones.
The tone 2 Sandy stuff is always in compounds.
Yeah.
So, it could be that they, it's not, they don't see it as being suitable to transfer. Or maybe they don't see it be suitable at, at the, until they're a little bit further on, but yeah.
And the other thing is that, these were pretty, let's say, simple sentences. So it wasn't, a context that was forcing them to push their grammar very far. It was a subject-verb-object sentence and with relatively frequent words. So we didn't have compound words at K4. So maybe if we try to add complexity to the syntax is... No. Thanks. Any questions? Just ahead next door.
Hi, I have a question about the flap in Spanish and the R of French. You were saying that the English speakers acquired the flap more easily than the French are, right?
Just in intervocalic context.
Yeah, in intervocalic. And then you mentioned that was probably a transfer from English, right?
Yeah.
Did you look at different stress to see if the stress, it was on the first syllable, whether it differed from stress on the second syllable?
It was in this particular project, we just had stress and stress, and we were not controlling for the position. For stress and unstress, this was an overall, it happened in stress and in unstressed syllables.
Okay, where the first syllable was stressed?
No, this were, it was like penultimate and ultimate stress. Just to be able to compare the ultimate stress with the French, and it was penultimate and ultimate stress. So it wasn't always the first syllable.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
No, we didn't control for we try to have like a bisyllabic or trisyllabic words that was, but we didn't control for we didn't have like antepenultimate stress words.
Okay.
And we just had those two.
Okay.
But in this case, the mean results were for stress and unstress syllables.
Okay. Thank you.
More questions?
Hi. Well, I have a question that is not directly related to what you presented today, but it's inspired by it. And it's a question that I think more than one person will have who's teaching Spanish to English and French speakers. Because you mentioned first your work on segmentals or on R's and stops and so on, and then you went to suprasegmentals or intonation. And one of the issues that always comes into play in the Spanish as an L2 or as a foreign language classroom is how do you help your students identify or learn the stressed syllable in Spanish, and especially in English where the pattern is primary and secondary stress, and then in French where as far as I know, in French, they have the final stress. Here, I'm not so sure. So I was wondering if you had thought of how to work with that issue, because you seem to be fascinated by intonation. Yes. And I am totally horrible with intonation, and I always learn something when you, the experts, present this kind of work. But I think that our worry in the classroom is more direct and are very specific, but our research goes far beyond that, and it doesn't really get to be applied to our specific needs. So I don't know if you've thought of that. How can we help with this research figure out little things like the ones that we need to apply in the classroom?
No, I mean, I have to teach. I mean, one of my courses that I've been teaching for, I think, 9 years is Spanish for heritage speakers. Mm-hmm. And with heritage speakers, every time that you have to teach them how to stress, how to write the stress, it's a big problem. It's sometimes even bigger than when you teach non-native speakers. And we're going in that direction. I mean, Jeff and I are just starting to work on unstressed vowels in French and Spanish. So that's our next project. But I mean, some of the things that they have to become aware of is that the correlates of stress are different in Spanish and in English. And in Spanish, what the impression they have when they are learning Spanish, the impression they have is that all vowels are accented. So they cannot identify the most prominent vowel because vowels are not reduced, so they think that they are all accented. And on the other hand, when we learn English, we produce full vowels all over the place. So that's, I mean, it's a counterpart. One of the things that I see that helps my students is like just to first make them aware of this difference. That I mean, they're going to hear full vowels in the whole word. The other thing is that they can play with duration, because if they cannot hear the pitch movement, which I mean, I don't think it's there all the time, but if they cannot hear the pitch movement, they should be able to hear the difference in duration. So just to highlight the difference in duration.
I think we all tried to use that trick, and that it gets to confuse the ones that were sure before we explained it. Mm-hmm. So I think it would be super interesting to play with these tools that you presented today, like the low-pass filter, and try to make them imitate, intonation of words, specific words in Spanish, to see if they can perceive those different tonal contours inside the word, and play with that and see if that helps.